Hello, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we unveil our first video focusing on Warhammer 40,000. So buckle up and get comfortable because for the next 3 weekly videos we're going to be finding out if this is the right game system for you, what's new in the upcoming 9th edition and a brief history of its lore. In 40k, as it will henceforth be named, you play as differing factions engaged in endless war across the length and breadth of the galaxy in the 41st millennium. There is no respite from the bloodshed, so you either suit up or get bled. There is no third option. 40k is a 28mm scale, wide-ranging miniature war game, with models varying from little pesky Gretchen, think goblins with stunted growth, to large hulking Imperial Knights, aka robotic combat walkers with gigantic weapons. The game, as I'm sure you can already gather, is sci-fi themed and set in the grim dark future. As such, you should expect advanced technology to be at your disposal, but also weird and wonderful races from throughout the cosmos. The choice of armies and factions can be somewhat overwhelming at first, with there being in the region of 15 completely unique factions to choose from, but that total at least doubles when you factor in all of the sub-factions. As such, there are literally endless possibilities for you to tell the story of famous battles from times past, or forge your own great theatres of war. And what wonderful timing for this video, because 40k's new 9th edition is just a few short days away from being released, and so there is simply no better time to take the plunge. This and the outgoing 8th edition are probably the most accessible versions of 40k ever released from a gameplay perspective, and I'll let you judge whether it's as approachable from a pricing standpoint. So to the game, well, Games Workshop take the approach, like its sister title Age of Sigmar, that there are 3 main ways to play. Open play, which is basically saying do what you want. We've given each unit an indicative power rating and we leave it to you what you do with that information. Narrative play is a compilation of different missions to choose from that reenact a battle of historical significance. And finally, the most popular way to play is matched play, where you and an opponent build an army with a mutually agreed points value, pick one of the dozen or so available missions and have at it. You'll need a play area that usually measures 6 foot one way and 4 foot the other, and you then follow a fairly conventional player turn sequence for any game that requires a measuring device that can tell you the distance in inches and a bunch of dice. And so begins with the command phase. This is where you bark your orders, inspire your troops and generally set your stall out for the coming turn, allowing for some bespoke rules to be in effect throughout your go. It's then time to shuffle your models in the direction you want. Each unit has its own move distance, with foot slogging infantry on one end of the spectrum and mounted units and vehicles on the other. But you can also forego the remainder of your turn and get a jog on by moving a further d6 inches, which, especially in the early game, is a familiar sight. The psychic phase is next, where it's time for your spellcasters, or psykers as they're called here, to start slinging spells. Some are aimed with malicious intent at your opponent's units, and others are more for the aid of your comrades, bestowing blessings and auras of sweet goodness on your fellow units. Success is 2d6 target number based, and varies dependent on the power of the spell. However, if your opponent has any psykers within range, they have the option to deny the witch and stop said shenanigans by rolling a higher number than you. So you've commanded, you've moved, now it's time to get your guns out. Glorious DAKKA. Shooty is a cornerstone of 40k combat, and the myriad number of weapons you have to choose from varies considerably in theme and form, but follows a fairly simple logic which will make sense in just a few moments. So each of your units in turn will pick an enemy that's in range of your weapons, and the dice will do the rest. First, you need to fetch a number of said 6-sided dice dependent on the weapon you're firing and roll a target number or more to see if you hit. This number will be appropriate to the skill of the firing model, and if you successfully hit, you'll roll the remaining dice to see if the hits were strong enough to wound the target. Here, the minimum target number will depend on the strength of the weapon and the toughness of the enemy. If you've got this far though, the enemy does get one last chance to save its own bacon, as it gets to make an armour save. The better the armour, the lower the target number they need to roll to ignore the wound. However, some weapons do have armour penetration that may negatively affect this. This little dice rolling sequence, which is mirrored later in the fight phase, is the core mechanism of the game. If you don't like the sound of this, then you probably won't like the game mechanically at all. So when the dust and smoke settles on a round of shooting, it's time to gear up for some good old fashioned charging. If you absolutely positively want to engage in some close combat, this is the time to put your best foot forward and try and sprint that last few meters to your target. Fighting in close combat then follows a similar mechanical sequence to shooting, with the main difference being that both sides are able to get their dice roll on. All units that have charged get to go first, and then you alternate activating units until everyone's had a swing at bat. The player turn then ends with the morale phase, where the mettle of even the most hardened warriors is tested. Basically, the more models a unit has lost during the turn increases the chances of you losing more at this point. So that's the game in a nutshell. Most missions will revolve around completing objectives and getting the most points come the end of a set number of rounds. But why would or wouldn't you choose this game system over the hundreds of other choices on the market? Number 1, if you like the idea of a sci-fi based large scale miniature wargame that isn't going to require a degree in learning rules to get to the table, then 40k has you covered. There are definitely a number of similarities in that regard to its sister Age of Sigmar, but 40k in its core rules is slightly more complex. Yes, you'll need to become proficient in all of your unit stats and that of their weapons, but this is certainly not an uncommon requirement for wargames. Number 2, you want a game that has more than one way to smash an egg in terms of inflicting violence on your opponent's plastic models. Then the fact that the core rules give equal weight to shooting from a distance than they do to face carnage will be a real boon for you. Yes, I have to admit that throughout the editions of 40k, the rules and all the armies have definitely favoured one or the other, but 9th edition looks like it's doing a number of things to ensure that that intended balance is there. Number 3, you want gorgeous miniatures, blah blah. I had to make this same point talking about Age of Blah. Bottom line is, Games Workshop are a miniature model making company first and foremost, and subjectively I know they are bloody good at it. Of course the sci-fi aesthetic has to work for you, but from an artistic standpoint there is little to fault with what you can buy on a sprue here. Number 4, there should be a beware before you enter sticker on the door, because this is not a cheap game system to get into. Don't get me wrong, 40k has a number of starter products to ease you in that represent decent value for money, but your next steps into a particular army or faction are going to be on the pricey side. You can argue all day as to whether the price you pay is appropriate for what you get, but the bottom line is that comparatively speaking, this is not a cheap game system. Number 5, we'll call flavour. Getting into 40k is like going into an ice cream store and realising you like 10 different flavours, but you've only bought enough money for 2 scoops. In other words, so long as you like the sound of the game so far, you're not going to be disappointed with the look, the feel, or the playstyle of one or more of the available factions. And if you really want, there is literally thousands and thousands of pages of lore and fiction for the 40k universe. So if you like to go deep and immerse yourself in a game, you will not be disappointed. So there you have it, the ups, downs, lefts and rights of Warhammer 40,000. A futuristic and grandiose miniature wargame that has been greatly refined over the years to its current incarnation, and is about as accessible as it's gonna get, so really deserves its lofty perch in the tabletop miniature gaming genre. Please let me know in the comments if 40k seems like the right fit for you, or if this still leaves you looking for something a little different. However, that's it from me. I'll see you next time.